Awesome. Well, it is the top of the hour wherever you are in the world. So we'll just, as people are rolling in, just continue on the how to participate in the workshop. Welcome to the second Bikepackers Guide virtual workshop. This one is bikes and gear. And what we are going to spend we're going to spend the next 90 minutes or so in this. I'm excited to see how many folks are here. Continue to introduce yourselves and where you're signing in from in the chat. Throughout the workshop, you can drop questions in the Q&A. You can also contribute to the workshop by adding things in the chat. That was something that was really fun last time, was just seeing how engaged folks were by contributing to things I was saying and kind of riffing off of each other. And that was really awesome. And that chat gets saved and sent on to you all after this. So it ends up being a living document. So if you have something to share or even a question, that can go in there. Noelle will be keeping tabs of that. If there are polls, please participate. This one will actually be mostly prompting chat contributions to keep the workshop moving along, because we have a lot to talk about tonight, because it's everyone's favorite topics. And then at the end of each section, there's a Q&A. And so as you're putting questions in the chat, like Noelle will go through them and pull out any that haven't been addressed when I take a break for questions in between each section, and we'll end with about 15 minutes, if I'm on top of time, for final questions at the end. So the goal with these is that while it is virtual and it's hard to be directly engaging, that you're live here with me and Noelle so that you can participate and have that customized education by asking questions. And then sometime tomorrow or at the latest Friday morning, you'll get a follow-up email that'll have a link to the recording. It'll include a link to that chat document, the saved chat, and also a PDF that's an additional resource that I'll create as a supplement, because believe it or not, in 90 minutes, we can't talk about everything. So that'll be where there'll be a lot of bonus information, and is one of the perks to this series. So without any further ado, we're going to move on to our quick review of who we are.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll just introduce myself quickly and then hand it back over to Kait. My name's Noelle Battle. I'm the executive director of Bikepacking Routes, and really excited to be here with you all today. One more reminder for people in the chat, if getting lots of messages that are still just coming to Kait and I. So if you want everybody to see where you're from, just change the little drop down to everyone and not host and panelists. And it is being recorded. We will share that out afterwards. I just see that question. But just to, I know a lot of you probably joined our first workshop, but not everyone. So if you're not familiar with Bikepacking Routes, thanks for joining us for the first time. We are a 501c3 nonprofit, and we're really the only nonprofit nationwide that is focused exclusively on supporting and advancing bikepacking, growing a diverse bikepacking community, and improving access and conservation of the landscapes through which we ride. So we have sort of three pillars focusing on route development, where we create and also curate and share great routes from dedicated route stewards around the country, and looking forward to really building that out to other parts of the country, just in the US for now. But looking to add a lot more routes. And then we also do community building activities. We host campouts and participate in bikepacking summits and other educational activities like this one to help open the opportunity to get into bikepacking to more and more people. And finally, we do advocacy work both at the local, state, regional, and national level, focusing on hopefully educating bikepackers to be good stewards of the land on which they ride, and helping try to leverage our relationships with government agencies to help conserve these landscapes that we're riding in. So you can check out our website if you want to learn more. We will be kicking off our end of year fundraising at the end of this week. We rely heavily on individual donations. So if you appreciated these workshops and are able to, we'd love your support to sign up. Thanks.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. I'm Kait Boyle. I use she, her pronouns. I'm calling in from home in Victor, Idaho, the land of the Eastern Shoshone and Shoshone Bannock people. And I'm really grateful for all of you who are tuning in. I'm psyched for everyone who's back for the second round. And if this is your first workshop, and if you like the intro to BPR, a quick intro to myself is that I started bike packing in 2011, riding the Kokopelli Trail with a backpack, which I don't recommend. One of the reasons I'm here to help you all get a better start off bike packing than I did. But that planted a seed for me. And the next year, I discovered some Revelate Designs bike bags, put them on my single speed 26-inch steel bike, and rode the Great Divide mountain bike route. And that completely ended up changing my life because it's turned into a career and a lifestyle for me. And that has led to bikepacking around the world, teaching the first college level bikepacking course at Prescott College with my teammate, friend, and co-founder of Bikepacking Roots, Kurt Ruffsnyder. And these days, I use bikepacking as a way to explore wild places through human-powered movement by my favorite medium of riding a bicycle. But sometimes that looks like moving on dirt. Sometimes that looks like moving on snow. And for me, it's mostly on a mountain bike, but I've loved and have really valued the time that I've spent touring on dirt roads and paved roads as well. And so this webinar is bikes and gear, setting up your bike for bike packing, gear selection, and packing your bike. And those three subtopics could all be their own topic that we could spend hours on. And so, as I mentioned at the beginning, there'll be an additional PDF. This is also a whole series of workshops. And so there'll be things I touch on today that we'll go deeper into in future workshops. And I'll kind of identify those as we go through the evening. But if anything, that's just another reason to stay with us through the series this winter. And that's just something to keep in mind as you think about what your questions are. So tonight we're going to talk about the workshops of the objectives of workshop 2, what the bikepacking bike looks like, setting up your bike for bikepacking, gear selection. Specifically, I'm not going to tell you what to bring, and we'll talk about why, but more unpacking the packing list so that it's intentional and thinking about packing on a systems level. And then finally, we're going to talk about packing strategies. Because again, there isn't one way to pack, just like there isn't one way to choose gear. And then it's not really an acronym, I guess, because it's just the ABCs, but some things to keep in mind when you think about how to load your bike for your bikepacking trip. And as I mentioned, there'll be Q&A opportunities in between each section, so we can take a breather, process a little bit, and then dive into the next one. So the first thing I want to talk about is our goals for why this session. And if you were here with me this 2 weeks ago for the first section, and if you're joining new, I have a question for you, and that is to put in the chat, and that is, what is the ideal bikepacking bike? And as you're putting that in, I just want to talk about how, building on that last session, when we talked about goals and how what you want to get out of your trip dictates how you choose a route or build a route, similar to that, what you want to get out of your bikepacking trip dictates the bike you ride and how you pack and choose gear. And I'm seeing a lot of the best bikepacking bike is the bike you have. And it is so true. And if you do have a fleet of bikes or a couple bikes or are thinking about getting a different bike, then the ideal bikepacking bike is the bike that is appropriate for the terrain that you want to ride in. And so these two photos are just to illustrate that bikepacking is fairly limitless in the places it can take you. And there's a lot of different styles of bikepacking that you can pursue. And we talked about that a lot in the first workshop, which is recorded and live. And so if you want to refresh yourself, you can go back to that. But the loaded bikepacking bike can look like a lot of different things. And so I have a quick little slideshow of all perfectly packed bikepacking bikes. And you'll see as we go through these, none of them look the same, just like none of the people look the same. And the point is that there's no right or wrong way to load a bike. But there are choices that you get to make when you choose the gear and when you choose how to put the gear on your bike that will have a big impact on how that loaded bike is set up for the goals that you've set for that trip. So I promised you all that if you know me, you know that I love goals. And it's because so much of what we do in our day-to-day life when trying to prepare for bikepacking or any goal or dream is we set intentions and we make mindful, deliberate decisions. And so with that, how you set up your bike makes a difference for how it's set up to achieve your goals. So when I'm talking about setup, we're going to start with just the bike before there's any additional gear. It's just you have your bike and there's some considerations for your existing bike. And then if you were replacing parts or upgrading to a different bike, some things to think about for your bikepacking trip. But there are some simple things you can do for your existing bike that will make that bike that you ride on day rides, or maybe you race on, or is your commuter, more ready to be the ideal bikepacking bike. The thing to think about are the differences. Are the differences between bikepacking and day riding. And so a couple things that immediately come to mind would be that your bike is heavier, and a heavier bike makes the bike harder to pedal. It also makes it slower or harder to stop. And it also puts more demand on parts. And then the other element is that in a lot of cases, when we're bikepacking, we're traveling longer distances and spending more time in the saddle. And that doesn't have to be the case. But when it is, then that additional time, the endurance element of riding, needs to be considered for your body, because as we identified, a heavier bike is harder to pedal, so your body is working harder. And so the setup of your bike should be setting your body up for success, for being comfortable. So the bikepacking bike setup, when thinking about how to make adaptations to your bike for the more weight element. A couple solutions are thinking about your chain ring. And if you have a 1x drivetrain or a 2x drivetrain or a 3x drivetrain, there are different things to think about. But the main thing is that you're trying to make your drivetrain have a range of gears that are easier. And so that easiest gear, your grainy gear, is easier to pedal. And a general good rule of thumb is to downsize 1 or 2 sizes of chain rings for bikepacking on the same terrain that you'd be riding on an unloaded bike. So for example, this picture is a 28 tooth chain ring, which a lot of people laugh at when I tell them that's what I ride, when Kurt tells them that's what he rides. But that bike unloaded, you'd probably ride the same mountainous terrain with a 32 tooth, maybe a 30 tooth. But bikepacking, we're going to go down to a 28. If gravel riding, you're riding a 38 tooth, then you'd probably go down to a 34. And that is just to that is to help your legs have more gears as the terrain gets harder, so that you're not just smashing a harder gear. If you're a dedicated single speeder, Similar, you would just change your gear ratio to make an easier gearing. So the chainring, and that is something that chain rings wear out. A lot of high quality chain rings from like Shimano, Wolf Tooth, like you can get strong chain rings that aren't fairly inexpensive as far as bike parts go for replacing. A slightly bigger investment would be thinking about if you're getting new brakes or when you're picking out a bike is just having stronger brakes, especially if you're riding on terrain with big or fast descents and a heavier bike. Because if you were to add 30 pounds of gear to your bike, suddenly you're adding 30 pounds of weight to that entire mass on the bike, and that's increasing the demands of braking power. So I ride 4-piston brakes, and I usually run larger rotors than my peers who are setting up their bikes for more of a fast and light setup or just the standard. Like a lot of bikes come depending on the type of bike, but will come with a standard rotor size. So another one that is kind of similar to the chainring, like as you ride, you wear out your tires. When you're thinking about getting new tires, thinking about getting tires that are ready to handle the demands of bikepacking. Increased weight increases the both the wear on the tire, but also the tire's propensity for sidewall slices and also pinch flats. So depending on the tire manufacturer will depend on what they call it, but some sort of reinforced sidewall is the way to go. And generally, especially if you live in rocky places, reinforced sidewalls are just a good thing to do if you're riding off paved roads. And then another thing that's kind of easy to forget because we're just getting ready for a bikepacking trip, making some changes, packing our bikes, is just that with that added weight, we need more pressure in our tires and our suspension. And that will just, the amount, I don't have a number, it just comes down to kind of identifying the sag on your suspension and identifying like what is the right amount of pressure once you get on your bike to have the similar amount, the similar feel that you had without the loaded bike. And for me, that's always something that I seem to be doing at the trailhead. And then kind of lastly would just be thinking about what is your frame and wheel, what is your frame and what are your wheels made of? Like when I started bikepacking in 2011, I remember it was like, oh, carbon things are going to break. And now like carbon bikes are so strong that carbon can do great bikepacking, but just know how old it is. Similar to steel, after the Great Divide mountain bike route on my little steel single speed, I had 5 cracks in my frame because it was a very old frame. And the cool thing is I welded it back together I had a friend do it and it continued to go mountain biking, but there is additional wear on frames. And so just to know what the condition of your frame is similar to your wheels and just be ready to be intentional about if that's appropriate for the bikepacking trip that you have planned. Wheels, whether aluminum or carbon, like often the super duper lightest ones might not be the most resilient when bikepacking, but the more trail oriented, enduro oriented, like touring oriented, those are going to be stronger. Generally 32 spokes per wheel will create a stronger wheel. So, and then with the field fixable parts, we're going to do our whole last workshop is on field repairs for bikepacking, but just being mindful of what it takes to fix different things in your bike. And that can include like, what kind of tools do you need? Like I tend to run 6-bolt rotors because they're easy to remove or tinker with a multi-tool opposed to a center lock. And that's just a choice that I make because I know that if I needed to pull a rotor off or do something to my wheel, that I would have the tool to do that. So that's just an example of field repairable gear. Then the next element of this bike setup are solutions to setting your bike up for your body's comfort. And everyone's different. What would be comfortable for me might not be comfortable for you. And so these are all just tips based on my experience personally, and then also coaching others. But we're thinking about this through the lens of endurance riding. Often bikes, both especially gravel and road bikes, but then also mountain, like more cross-country oriented mountain bikes, will have a pretty steep slope from the saddle height to the handlebar height. And so whatever it is that you normally ride for shorter rides during the day, think about just raising your stem, not plural, so that your bars are just a little bit higher, and that'll just bring your position up a little bit. And all that does is reduces the strain on your back and your neck for maintaining that long all day position. And that is something to play with. And I'd also say start riding in that position before your first bikepacking trip so that you know that it works for your body, because you don't want to be finding yourself creating a new body ailment because of how you changed your bike position. Grips are often a big thing for bikepackers because, again, that endurance element of pressure points. Just you need to have, well, you don't need to, but a lot of people want to have different hand positions. And so if you're on flat bars, you can find grips that allow you to put your hands in different positions, like little bar ends, the little internal bar ends, bar hooks, and then different shaped grips to reduce dampening as well. And then with drop bars, I think that's one of the reasons that we saw kind of a popularity in wider drop bar mountain bikes, like you can see both of these gals have on their bikes. They just provide a lot of different hand positions that bikepackers often really like. And when choosing bars or thinking about bars, you want to be thinking about the terrain you're riding, because some people don't want to maneuver or handle their bikes in technical terrain on drop bars. And then with the saddle, this applies to not just bikepacking, but any longer style riding, but especially bikepacking, because you have to get back on your bike every day. Like, unfortunately, when you have saddle sores or an uncomfortable bum area and you wake up in the morning, you don't want to get back on your bike, you might have to. And so something that you can do that is huge to reduce the likelihood of that happening is finding the right saddle for you by getting a saddle fitting, talking to friends, borrowing saddles, trying them. In another workshop, the one on Bikepacker self-care and mindset, I'll talk more about this because it is under the self-care element. But the saddle for me is a huge way that I set my bike up for bikepacking success. With the crank length and saddle height, this just comes down to your bike fit. Like, getting a professional bike fit is going to be the best way to get your bikepacking bike set up for you properly. But it is common to see people. I often see people with incorrect saddle heights. And if you don't know your crank length, it's just worth knowing in relationship to your body. And then lastly, or there are two more. One is just thinking about how, when we are packing our bike, it's very common to have frame bags that bulge out and interfere with our pedal stroke, or to have maybe little bags up by the handlebars that interfere with your knees when you stand up to climb. And so when you're selecting your bags and packing your bike, you want your bike to be packed in a way that it isn't interfering with your pedaling dynamics, because that would could lead to some sort of physical ailment. And then with pedals, a lot of people ask about flats versus clipless. And I think that the best thing to do is to use what you normally ride in. It's pretty much as simple as that. If you want to change for one reason or the other, then I would just start playing with that pedal, not on a bike packing trip. Okay. Are there any questions? I know that was a lot of chatting. Are there any questions about that section on just setting up your bike? I cruised through it because the meat and potatoes of this whole thing are coming up with gear selection and then packing the bike. Can someone not hear me?
I think most people can hear, but
Great.
yes. Um,
Great, thanks.
yeah, no, not too many questions have come up. I did mention that there was a discussion about chamois, no chamois.
Oh,
I'll
yeah,
talk about that more in the self-care
yeah,
section. I was looking for the link to the article you wrote about that recently.
yeah. One of my favorite
Oh, there was
topics.
a question about how do you know when your saddle is at the right height?
That is a good question. I would recommend, well, a bike fit is going to be the best way to know what is like the exact down to the millimeter height for you. There are other strategies that you can look up online for kind of a ballpark. Um,
And if your knees start hurting, yeah, as Chuck just said, try that sooner rather than later, to maybe save yourself. That happened to me on a recent tour. My saddle was probably too low and it caused some knee problems because I didn't address it soon enough.
yeah, I think we've all been there at one point. That happens to me this time of year actually because I put on winter shoes and the height of my shoe is different than my summer shoes in relationship to my pedals. They're taller because they're like thicker. All right, a good rule of thumb for crank length. I think that is hard to try out. Again, that's like a bike fit thing. If you have, I speak of this as a short person and as someone with some pretty serious back injury histories. And I've learned that having a shorter crank is best for my body. And a lot of bikes come spec'd, if you buy a complete bike, will come spec'd with a longer crank length than maybe, especially on smaller frames. And so, for example, if a large came with a 170 or 175, it's not uncommon that a small would also come with a 170 or 175. But if you're a shorter person, especially, or if you have some sort of hip related injury, it's worth just looking into through with a professional that's not me. The shorter crank. And that's really like especially relevant if you're wanting to ride longer days, because like anything, it's just more and more circles that you're pedaling round and round.
There's a question about considerations for getting a steel, aluminum, titanium, or carbon bike.
Oh man, that is a heated topic. I have ridden them all, and I think that they all have their pros and cons. Um, and I think that the main thing is to just look for a quality bike that has a good reputation for not breaking, because those are going to be the best for bike packing. If there are cheaper or less expensive bikes that have a history of cracking in certain places, like that would be a red flag for me for um purchasing to go bike packing on. And all materials break. So does Hank carry his own gear? We're kind of stuck on how to get Hank to go bike packing. He won't sit in a trailer.
I finally, 2 years later, have ordered my Christmas present. It's a dog trailer.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah. There's a question about, do seat post bags that angle off from the seat post actually stay there without sagging?
That's a great question, and we're going to get into that in that last section of the actual loading the bike part. But the short answer is yes. It's all how you pack it.
And then there's a question on like data on best gear to have, like suggestions for tents, bags, pads. We're gonna get into that more.
Yeah, we'll get into that. Definitely. Um, awesome. Well, I think I'm going to carry on so that we stay on time. And the next round of questions will be after this next section on gear selection. And the only thing I'm going to say before I dive into this is with gear selection, I'm not going to talk a lot about different brands and models. I'll show you, you'll see in pictures, obviously, what I have and what I have photos of, and I can talk a little bit about like materials I really like. But this, I know there are a lot of people here who have a lot of experience. And so please if there is a certain type of gear that you really recommend for bike packing, whether it's a sleeping pad or a sleeping bag, when we get to that category, please contribute, because I think that's a great way for this to be a collaborative workshop, so that your input's going in and I don't just spend all of your time listing off all the different reputable brands. And of course, at the end of this session, if you have a specific question about a certain kind of gear that you saw in a picture or that you want to know what I'm using, then I'm happy to share. Okay. So this is why I'm not going to give you a specific bullet point packing list for every single item you need to pack, because there's so many considerations. I was thinking about it, and I think for every bike packing trip I've gone on over the last 12 years, something like that, I probably haven't ever brought an identical kit on each trip or set it up identically for each ride on my bike, because there's no way to recreate the trip identically. Like, we're always going to have slightly different weather, even if you rode the same route. Or maybe your itinerary is a little different. And so there are a lot of different considerations when thinking about the packing list. And that's why we're going to go through systems rather than individual items. In the PDF that I send out with this, with this recording, I'll include packing lists that I've sent out for that college course, for bike packing routes, campouts, for trips with friends. Like, I'll send those because they're useful to reference, just if anything, as a mental checklist. But the considerations include where you're going, the climate for that trip and the landscape, the trip length. Packing for a 3-day trip where you know exactly what that weather forecast is really different than packing for a 30-day trip where you're basically packing for anything that could potentially happen in that season, in that location. And in a lot of parts of the world, maybe the 2 seasons that shoulder that season. The weather forecast, what your overnight plan is, like, it is, you can, as we talked about in the first workshop, you can go bike packing without much of an overnight kit because you're going from accommodation to accommodation, like lodge to lodge. And if that's the case, your packing list is going to be really different than if you're going out for a self-supported ride. What your meal plan is, again, like, you can go for a full long bikepacking trip without ever cooking a single thing yourself, and so you don't need a kitchen. Or you could go for a full bikepacking trip where you make every single meal, and that will dictate that part of the packing list. Your body, similar to kind of those considerations for setting up your bike, like how you load your bike and the gear that you choose will be dictated by things like, are you a hot person? Are you a cold person? Are you going to be really uncomfortable if you wear a backpack? That sort of thing. And then your skill level and experience, we're going to talk about this more, but just your gear choices should reflect your ability to keep yourself and maybe the people you're with safe with that gear. And that will look really different depending on if you're brand new to camping or backcountry travel, or you have made a career out of guiding other people. And there's, again, no right or wrong way. It's just what is ideal for you. A huge thing, and this is where kind of my desire, my goals to be riding in the mountains and in more remote places, and being a 5'2" person on an extra small frame, generally a mountain bike, like, I have very limited amount of space, and that has kind of forced this strategy of learning how to carry less or do more with less. And then finally, like, your route familiarity will inform the gear you choose, and that has a lot to do with like how confident you can be in getting to certain places along the way, or sticking to your itinerary and having kind of backup plans. So the first element, we're in unpacking the packing list. We're gonna have 3 categories of the packing list, and I love them all. The first one are the ride essentials. And this is basically everything that you should be carrying for a long day ride, a remote ride, regardless of if you're camping or not. And I think that this is a really good place to start, because just like how bikepacking is a day ride, but then you make it multiple days, you start by thinking about what do you need on that long day ride. So the water and food part, there's the whole next workshop on January 10th is dedicated to that. So we're gonna just say, yes, you need water and food, period. The next would be a GPS with base maps, or a way to navigate reliably. That can be your phone, that could be a handheld device, that could be a cycling specific computer. With the Ride with GPS specific workshop this winter, we'll talk more about how to utilize those different things. But when, like, I personally use a Garmin Edge, and then I carry my phone with downloaded maps as a backup. And especially for longer trips, I bring a paper map because I love them, and they're something I like to read at night. They're also useful. A repair kit with the miniature knife. That miniature knife part is a tool for the kitchen. It's also a tool for other repair things. And that's one thing that I don't always have on a day ride, but that goes into my repair kit. I'm not going to break down the repair kit tonight. We will talk more about that on that last field repair workshop in March. And I will send you a list with a complete gear repair kit list, a complete list of gear repair kit contents in that post-workshop PDF this week. But a repair kit for your bike. And there are some universal things that we would add in there for repairing other types of gear, like clothes, bike bags. A phone and or satellite communication, knowing which one depends on how you know how your route's cell phone service is. But satellite communicators are fantastic in these days. They are tiny. You can see in that picture, there's a spot, and I think that there's a inReach. There should be an inReach somewhere. Maybe, oh yeah. In the lower picture, this little guy is a Garmin Messenger, and you can see that that's actually a satellite communicator that's smaller than the GPS here. So incredibly valuable. Jacket or layers. This is intentionally fairly non-specific. It's basically like, if you had to stop riding and sit in the weather that you could have on that day or on that trip, what would that be for riding? And we'll talk more about layers for camping, but like having that rain layer, that warmer layer, what it is that you can be wearing when it's actively weathering on you so that you're staying warm and dry. Lights, what that looks like depends a lot on if you're riding at night, riding on roads, the time of year. But if you're at a minimum, a good headlamp with reliable battery life and backup batteries, but adding in bike lights and a blinky for sure if you're on roads at all. But if you're going to be riding at night, having 2 lights is very helpful. First aid kit, again, the contents of that should be dictated by taking like a wilderness first aid or a wilderness first responder course, because they should be informed by your skill level. But that first aid kit should be built with bikepacking in mind. Like, you don't need to be carrying a tourniquet on a bikepacking trip, but you do need the ability to really be stopping bleeding and managing pain. Water treatment, that going to talk a lot more about on January 10th in water and food. So I'm just skimming over that, but just having something, even if you're planning on getting water out of like from stores or from spigots that are treated like city type water, then still carrying something to treat water so that you can get surface water. and drink it safely if you had to. And then the generic toiletry type things that your body needs: sunscreen. I can't go anywhere without lip balm. If you have any medications you need to ride with, and if you're on the chamois cream train. Something to be revisited in self-care. Batteries and charging cords, basically just thinking about if you needed to use your phone or your satellite communicator device or your lights or any of these electronics, what is the battery life and how do you make sure that you're not going to run out of battery in that kind of what if situation? Not just your planned use of it, but if you actually had to use it. And then lastly, the paper map. I think I'm slowly coming around to it being okay if you can trust that you have two electronic map sources and the confidence that you can keep them charged, that you don't need one. And I think they don't really weigh anything and are very, very valuable to have. So these are your essentials. The next category is the overnight kit. So we have what you need to just be riding for a longer amount of time, covering some distance, being in a remote place. And that would include from like lodge to lodge. This would be very determined by those considerations of what is your overnight plan? Are you camping? Are you staying in huts? Are you staying in lodges? Are you cooking? Are you eating out? Are you just eating snacks for dinner, which you can do? So these are systems, and I'm going to dive into each of these after we go through these kind of 3 elements of the packing list. So the systems would be your shelter system, your sleep system, your clothes in addition to that ride clothes layer, your kitchen, and your personal hygiene system. More of the personal hygiene we'll talk about in the self-care, and then also in the Bikepacker skills part, because I think pooping is a very important skill for everyone who recreates outside to have. So we're not going to finish this series without talking about it, but it's not going to be tonight. With all of these, when you choose what makes up these systems, that consideration of your skill level and experience and your comfort with operating gear in the backcountry or in a camping setting is going to dictate what these systems look like. And just some examples are what layering systems look like how competent are you in managing your temperature in the climate that you're going to be bikepacking in. If it makes you if you're going to have a hard time managing layers in an actively raining, cold situation, bringing more layers is really smart. It's not always smarter or better to bring less. The best amount of stuff is the amount of stuff to match your skill level. And the more you do this and practice with your systems, the more you could be like, oh, well, actually, I didn't need that one thing. And so next time, maybe I don't have to bring it. And then we have this category, and this is my favorite category. And when I taught adventure education for Prescott College and for Knowles, this was my favorite category to talk about, because despite what some people might think when they look at my bike, I am not anti non-essentials. I love the non-essentials. The main thing is that with the non-essentials list, which I named fluff a long time ago, so I just have to call it fluff, is that these are things that could hugely contribute to your bikepacking trip. For example, my husband here is fly fishing on a bikepacking trip with Hank. It was very short. Hank walked himself. He wouldn't have been able to go fly fishing and be on a bike fishing trip if he hadn't brought a fly rod. But it's not an essential thing to be safe and go bikepacking. There are some things that would be fluff when suddenly there's like not really a use for it and it's not contributing to your trip. So the main thing that I want to ask you to drop into the chat is, what is your fluff? What do you love to bring that isn't essential to the trip, like technically being able to happen, or you staying safe and managing risk on the trip, but it adds to your experience? And this is I am most excited about this part of the chat for the evening because I think the list is so incredible. And my list here are everything from things that I've had students bring, like flagging tape, laser pointers that I had no idea that they're bringing, a pair of jeans for a trip that wasn't going through a town. And then things that I love to bring, like glitter, incense. I have brought a mini Buddha on my trip, essential oils. I've also
What's the
carried a,
glitter for?
what's that?
What's the glitter for?
Oh, putting on your face. Roll on. It added to my mood, so it added to my trip.
All right.
And a lot of these things I've brought, it just depends on the goal of the trip. So like camp shoes and town clothes and books and journals and camp chairs and art supplies and camera gear, like all those things are really helpful. The main thing with this list is once you've gotten through those first two lists, be intentional. Excuse me. Be intentional and make a conscious decision to bring the fluff. And when it's contributing weight or taking up space, and especially if it's making you rethink some of the essential things, that's where it's worth coming back to this list and saying, oh, wait, actually, I do need a shelter, but maybe I don't need the hammock as well. But if you have room for both and the goal is to sleep in the hammock, then great. It's all allowed. Oh, a harmonic music. Yes. I wish I was musical. Okay. So, systems explained. We're going to talk about shelters, the sleep system, the kitchen, layering a bit. Layering is going to come a lot more in self-care. I'm not going to necessarily teach you how to layer, just more talk about the concept. And bike bags, we're just going to talk about those for vocabulary purposes and then dive deeper into bike bags with Eric Parsons from Revelate in the winter. So, shelter systems. We're going to go from the most minimal to the least. And again, just like everything we've been talking about, there's no right or wrong. It's just what is most appropriate for your trip and all those considerations we had talked about with like the weather and the route and the climate and your comfort and whatnot. Number of people is also a consideration. So the bivvy. Bikepackers love bivvies. They're great because they fit one person. They're great because they're light and compact. You don't need a pole or any hardware like stakes. It's a very small footprint, which means like when I talk about that, it's easy to find a spot to lay down. Like you just need a spot the size of your body that's flat enough to your standards. It doesn't need to fit a whole tent. And so then with multiple people, you can spread out if you need to. Bivvies add warmth because it's like putting a rain jacket over a down jacket, like it traps that heat. With that is the adverse side effect of that is that as your body breathes, the bivvy can sweat and condensate on the inside. And so then your sleeping bag is often wet when you wake up in a bivvy. And so making time to dry your sleeping bag suddenly becomes a part of your day. You can also cook and eat sitting in your bivvy. And when I'm going to be talking about this, cooking and shelter situation is to know that there's always the element and question of, are you in bear country? Or what are the regulations around cooking in camping and food storage? And then also what is actually smart risk management? I would not be cooking a meal in my bivvy where there are bears. I would be cooking somewhere farther away, about 100 yards, and then I'd be sleeping elsewhere. We'll talk more about that in the camp skills workshop, but that's just the disclaimer with this. Minus to bivvies, the do I talked about, they don't protect you from bugs. Bugs can crawl on your face. Same with critters. So that's a personal comfort thing and a location thing. Wind and rain, they'll protect you from wind except for your face. And if you're depending on where you are, you might be sleeping in wind with dust or sand blowing over your face. And then similar with rain, they're a little harder to manage because there's that inevitable head opening. Some bivvies have hoops that can create more of like a little tent over your head. And if privacy is a consideration, there isn't any really. Like you're just going to be sleeping out, and anyone who goes by you is going to see you. And if you're with a group, you're all just out in your bivvy. The next level up from a bivvy and little tiny bit less minimal is a tarp. Tarps are very light. They're very compact. They're very roomy. You can set them up high and be able to sit up under them for generally a pretty small footprint. Like this tarp here, I think is 8 by 10. You can have 2 people in there with plenty of space. You don't have to touch each other. And you can both sit up and not have your head hit the tarp if you set it up high enough. It can be great sun protection. And then when set up really well, like low and tight to the ground, they can be very effective protection from the elements, including wind and rain. But you have to be able to have the skills and awareness to set them up in orientation to the wind so that the tarp's working for you and not against you. Depending on the environment you're riding through, you don't need poles or hardware. You can set them up between trees and using rocks, but you can also carry tiny little stakes, and you can use your bike as a way to set up the tarp using the handlebars laying on the ground as one of the ends. And you can carry little stakes if you don't think you'll find what you need to anchor it. I love tarps. I think for all these reasons. Similar to bivvies, they don't help you at all with bugs or critters. And there's not much privacy. So as far as like from other people, because you can see into them. And then with tarps, if they're set up high enough, you can cook under them because there's plenty of ventilation. But if you have an open flame from some of the types of stoves, then that would be something to be very mindful of. The next one are mids. There are kind of 2 styles of mids that bikepackers bring. One's a smaller 2-pole mid, like this one here, and one's a larger 1-pole mid that's more of just a teepee shape, square teepee. These are very similar to tarps in that they're just one wall. They fit just a couple people. They're very minimal with poles and hardware. Like you just need the little poles. You can get carbon ones really easily. Similar to tarps, they reduce dew, but they dew on you, but the walls will sweat. And so if you brush up against them, they'll often be quite wet. They're a little less roomy because they actually come down to the ground, unlike a tarp. And then you can get bug bodies or bodies to these that are mesh, and that would help keep critters or bugs out. But that suddenly makes it a double wall tent that we'll talk about. Mids are often nylon or Cuban fiber, depending on where you get them, and both are fantastic. Cuban fiber is very strong and very light. It's a little more bulky, and Cuban nylon is very compact, a little heavier, and tears a little more easily. Okay, single wall tents. Single wall tents are enticing to bikepackers because it's less material than a double wall tent. However, this would be, and what these would look like would be one complete piece of fabric that poles go on the inside, and there's no mesh, so you can fully close it. However, then you're inside a marginally breathable shelter that's pretty small, and so all your breathing and body heat is creating condensation, so they're hard to ventilate. They're really good in winter because they add warmth, and those colder temperatures require a little less ventilation. But they're often also not fully waterproof because they actually need to be breathable. And so they do well in winter because there isn't actually water. It's not raining. It's would be snowing, or the temperatures are cold enough that the water or precipitation is frozen. But they do work well in the mountains and are especially good for bikepacking. But when you're thinking about like, oh, well, I want a tent, but I don't really want the whole body and the fly, beware when thinking about single wall tents, because they are very much made for winter materials or winter climates. And then as we're getting into tents, a downfall of these is that you cannot operate a stove inside them without risking carbon monoxide poisoning or burning your tent down. Okay, double wall tents. These, you can get solo double wall tents, like Big Agnes I know makes a really popular bikepacking styles, like ultralight through hiker styles, solo person tent. They're generally going to be very small, kind of coffin like, but they still have the body like you see here, where there's some material, but also a lot of mesh and poles. And then there's a waterproof fly that goes over it. Those two layers create the breathability. So there's air moving in between the mesh and the fly. And that's why the fly is able to be really waterproof. The downfall of these is you have to carry all of the poles and both the body, which will be quite a bit of material because of the mesh and the zippers, and then also the fly. There are places for these though, and if you're not going to sleep because you're worried about critters or bugs, or the stars keep you up, like tents are worth it because you want to be able to sleep well at night. Like you're going to have a better time bikepacking the next day if you get a good night's sleep. There are also some places like Australia where it's just known that you don't sleep out because of how many poisonous snakes and spiders there are. Then lastly, if your shelter plan is to go from hut to hut, but you're in more remote places like off well-traveled roads, you still want to bring something that you could spend the night out in, and that would most likely be a bivvy. But if you're a group of people, maybe that is a small tarp, which could be the size of a bivvy packed. Like often they're about the size of a like a soda can packed. And so very small, but just something that you could set up if you didn't make it to your hut. I think for road touring, because you are more likely to be able to be like, okay, well, I didn't make it, I'm going to get a ride by a passing car, like I'm going to get help. That's more fine for not having a backup. Cool. The next thing for sleeping systems, again, not going specifically into gear, I'm loving seeing how people are plugging in gear that they love. This is going to be such an ultimate resource for everyone. Is the sleeping system. So without going into brands or specific models, with the sleeping bag, I think about down versus synthetic. I prefer personally down bags because they're light and they compress very well. And so on that very small person spectrum of not a lot of space, I really value a very compressible sleeping bag. I also really value sleeping and not being cold at night. And so I tend to bring a bag that is rated to a little bit warmer than the temperatures I'm likely to ride in. So for example, if the lows are probably going to be around 40, I'm still bringing a 30-degree bag, even though I'm going to wear all my clothes, because I just sleep cold. With that, with the sleep system, your sleeping bag is part of your layering system. I know there are people out there who are dedicated naked sleepers, and that's fine. However, you're going to get the most bang for your buck as far as your bikepacking kit goes if your sleeping bag is a part of your layering system and you're wearing your clothes to bed, because you do things like put your down jacket open, like no, don't wear it, but unzip it and drape it over you like a quilt inside your sleeping bag, and pull your ride pants over your long underwear. Those things will not only actively dry the clothes that you were maybe sweating in a bit, but they'll also increase the warmth of your sleeping bag. And so that's one way that I would get away with for that 40-degree situation, not needing to carry a 20-degree bag because I sleep so cold. I just wear all my clothes and it's great. And then in the morning, I don't have to get dressed, which is one thing I really don't like. One reason I don't like getting out of my sleeping bag often is not wanting to be cold. The foam versus inflatable. This depends on your body. There's no right or wrong way. I used to travel around the world with 0 sleeping pad. I just brought a wind shield, like a car windshield reflector thing, and I strapped it on my handlebar roll with my handlebar bag, and I slept great. And that was because in my 20s, I could do that. And I was fine with that. And I have since broken my back and my pelvis, and I'm slowly aging. And I will not sleep without a quality inflatable sleeping pad and a pillow. And my 20-year-old self is just rolling her eyes at me now, but now like I'm not going to sleep with a pillow made out of my handlebar bag or my backpack or my jacket for maybe more than a night because I'm wearing all that stuff. um and so that tiny inflatable pillow, I wish I had a picture of Kurt holding it as he turned me onto it, but it's like it's tiny. I mean, it's like 2 inches tall. It's so worth it because I actually don't have a sore back in the morning. The foam pad can be great. Just figuring out where to strap it is generally the problem, but you can get it horizontal across your seat bag. You can get it horizontal across your handlebar bag. It just depends on what your setup looks like. But they're also really good in the winter. So they have good R values often. The ground sheet question mark. A lot of people don't think about these, but just a strip of Tyvek or a little Cuban fire sheet is worth the insignificant weight or packing space because it's something to sit on when you get to camp. And then if you didn't bring a chair, and then it's also going to protect your bivy or your tent and definitely your sleeping pad from getting any holes. Okay, the kitchen. I'm going to go a lot more into stove types when we're talking about meal planning, but you want to be thinking about, and this is a good thing for people to throw in what they really like. Bikepackers tend to be drawn to kind of small, like pocket rocket style isobutane stoves because they boil water really fast, they're efficient, and they're very tiny. Again, on that, they're about the size of my pillow. They're a little heavier. The downfall of them is that they take isobutane, which is a fairly specific thing to have to resupply. And so you need to know that wherever you're resupplying has fuel. It's also really challenging to find internationally. And that's where the alcohol stove comes in. Alcohol stoves can be super light. You can also make them yourselves out of little beer cans or tin cans. And they just burn alcohol, which you can find around the world. You just have to be able to find the kind of purest level that you can to burn well. But I've had success bikepacking in more remote places in lesser populated countries, finding alcohol at pharmacies and at hardware stores, even at gas stations. And just the quality of the alcohol will determine how kind of successful you're or how efficient your stove is running. But they're very small, very light. And the main downfall is depending as in cold temperatures and at higher altitude, they can be less efficient and they just kind of take some time. You're not going to get like very much control as far as flame control. I think I've probably bike packed equally with those two styles. The white gas style stove, if you're thinking about winter, then that's like a whole different world of camping, but that's where a white gas stove would, such as the MSR Whisperlight, would be really relevant. The pots and utensils, the main thing is just less is more. Like when we're going to go into this more with the food and water workshop, but we don't want to have redundant gear and things like pots and cups and bowls and pans. Like those take up a lot of space. You can't squish them. Mostly there are kind of some collapsible cups out there. But thinking about who you're bikepacking with, like, are you sharing a kitchen? Do you actually need 2 pots? Do you need 2 bowls and a pot? Can your bowl be your mug as well? Like, yeah, I love to have my coffee and breakfast at the same time, but I'd rather just carry one thing and drink out of it and then eat out of it, or vice versa. Okay, the layering. When we talk about layering, again, this is going to be, and we're going to dive more deeply when we have more time in the self-care workshop. But what we want to think about it's similar to what we were thinking about with the sleeping bag. It's like, how are all your clothing choices working together to create a whole system so that you don't just have a piece of gear that serves one purpose, but then is redundant with something else. And so a lot of this depends a lot on the climate and what weather you're encountering, how hard you're going to be working, like things that are hard to predict and talking about in this workshop. And so when we think about layering, we're thinking about materials and making sure that we're wearing materials that are going to be wicking. There's an asterisk to that comment I'll come back to. And then trusting and practicing on day rides in your ability to actively dry your clothes as you're wearing them. And so generally, my goal would be to have clothes like I have my base layer that I'm riding in, and then I get to camp, and unless it's like really sunny, it's going to dry instantly. I'm going to put something on over that, and then over that, and then my body is going to be drying that layer. And then that's what I sleep in. I would personally take my sportswear off just for feminine hygiene, because that so I don't get salt rashes, but like I'm going to be sleeping in the long sleeve in the shirts that I'm also riding in. And that's a personal thing. Like, and I bathe on longer trips, like I go swimming, I'll rinse my clothes, but I found that my body tolerates that. Shorts, on the other hand, I for longer trips, the most number of pairs of shorts I'd bring is 2. And that is so that I have a pair that I can rotate with different seam patterns. I don't wear chamois. We'll talk more about that in another workshop. But whether you wear chamois or not, 2 pairs of shorts is good for hygiene and preventing saddle sores, and that are different styles, like for the seams. So you have rubbing in different places potentially. And so you can have them on rotation. So you can clean them out, have them drying, and then be wearing a different pair. And then I bring something that I can sleep in that is not what I'm riding in. And that's just really good hygiene practice. And that works for me for base layers. Similarly, socks, I bring 2 pairs of socks. I wear a pair, and then I have a sacred sock pair. And that pair of socks I'm not going to ride in until the last day. And it's one of my favorite things about the last day is I get to wear a pretty clean pair of socks because all I did was sleep in them. But those socks are going to stay dry, and they're going to stay with my sleeping bag. And they're what I wear after my feet have been wet all day, either from sweat or rain or water crossings. And then I get to camp and I get to have dry feet. And that's a way that I'm preventing like immersion foot or and helping blisters, prevent blisters. But then if you got blisters, that would help them heal too. And so then what the layers on top of that look like, having some sort of insulative layer, and then rain layers that are all appropriate for that environment that you're riding in. Okay. The last of our systems that we're going to talk about is a prologue to the workshop with Eric Parsons, which I'm very excited for, the founder of Revelate Designs. And these are not bike bag models. These are just generic terms to describe the bags, so that which may feel basic if you've been bikepacking, but these are just so we have universal language to be talking about these things. So when I go into packing, we're on the same page about what bags can be called. And so these aren't the names that like this company gave them. So we have seat bags. These are just going to be the bags, regardless of the size, that strap to the rails and the seat post. We also have frame bags, which can look a variety of different ways. They can be anything that takes up all the space of the frame, like you see here, or they could take up just a part of it where they're leaving room for water bottles also in your frame if you're so lucky to be tall enough to ride a bike that's big enough to provide room for that. I know nothing about that. Top tube bags can be the bags that are strapped anywhere to the top tube. They often look like this blue one here. Sometimes there are some that go the full length of the top tube, and then there are also some that just sit over on the nook between the seat tube and the top tube. The handlebar roll, a lot of different companies make different styles of this for a system. It's often a system with like a harness and then an actual bag. But that is strapped to the handlebars and then secured to somewhere around the head tube and the fork. And then we have a fork mount water bottle over here, which is obviously not a bag, but often talked about in bike packing. Continued, we have the handlebar pocket, which would be a bag that goes on top of the handlebar roll. So it's increasing capacity on your handlebars. Additional style fork mount bags. There are some that are just cages where you could put things like this fuel bottle or the water bottle in the last picture, or they're actual bags that you can stuff things into, like a tent body or shoes. And then the beloved rack system, which could go on the back or the front. Or I should say it could go on the back. It could also only go on the front. That's a little less common, or it could go on both. And to the rack, you could mount panniers, which would be the little bags that are attached to the sides of the rack, or you can strap very large, bulky things, or potentially smaller things, to the top. Like this person here has a large stuff sack and then also a foam pad. And so these are a number of the different styles of bags that you are likely to find or be thinking about for packing your bike. All right. Time's flying. Questions before we go into our last section, which is just talking about the strategy of loading the bike, and recognize that it's 6:12 for wherever in the world you are. It's 12 past the hour. And so we have about 20 more minutes allocated. And so I want to answer some questions, then move through this, and then finish up with all the questions.
Couple of quick questions. There was one question from the chat that was about dynamo hubs.
What was the question?
Like thoughts on using them, or?
Yeah. So my thoughts on dynamo hubs, which are basically hubs that are somehow engineered to generate power. And so you can have a cord coming out of your hub that then you can have a little outlet or port on your bike that you can plug your electronics into. So you can be charging as you're riding. They are effective when you're pedaling at higher speeds. I don't have the specific mile an hour in my head of where they get less effective, but basically I've found that if you're on a mountain bike packing route where you're riding often under like 7 miles an hour, 5 miles an hour, often walking speed, that you're not generating any power. And so you actually need time, like either on really long descents, which is actually not very much time. Even a long descent, like a 40-minute descent, isn't a ton of time in the day for charging and generating power. So like it's on those trips where you're moving at like 8 plus, 10 plus, 12 plus miles an hour and able to have that consistency where you're going to actually get a benefit from the charge. And that's just my experience. And I think that maybe different brands have different specific results around that.
Have an interesting
numbers.
Question from someone joining us from a bike company asking, what's one thing you wish more bike companies would do or not do when it comes to designing bikes for bike packing?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think this is going to be my answer based on like my preference for riding in more kind of backcountry settings where like I don't want a bike that's over engineered with all the gadgets for like all the different places to mount things. Like I personally really like the simplicity of a frame bag, a handlebar roll, and then either like a little rack like Lauren has here, or a tiny seat bag and a backpack. Um, and so, and with that, like there's great reason for good standover clearance for shorter people for mountain biking, but I prefer to have a little bit less standover clearance in order to have more frame bag space, because as you might see behind me, you I there are some very tiny frame bags out there, and the amount that I can fit in my frame bag is often pretty laughable. But
Yeah.
but that's where top tube bags come in.
Small triangle, not very jealous of people with large bikes. Um,
Totally.
question on tubes or tubeless with packing.
Yeah, tubeless I think is great. I always carry tubes in case I have a flat that won't plug, or I have to repair a sidewall and I can't get it to reseat, which you can do. But tubeless will let you run lower pressure, and with that, your ride is going to be more comfortable and compliant over rougher terrain, including like washboard. And also punctures just seal better.
Question on cycling specific clothing. For example, I'd not go bike packing with leg warmers, arm warmers, and a windbreaker. I'd use wool tights and a long sleeve shirt and my rain jacket, but I would wear those on a long ride. So like, I guess thoughts for specific cycling clothing.
Yeah. I think this depends a lot on what you're comfortable riding in. I don't ride in chamois, as I've said, and I don't really ever wear a jersey with like a zip up jersey with pockets. That's just not part of how I carry my stuff. And so I tend to just ride in like a merino t-shirt or 3/4 sleeve or long sleeve, depending on the, how I feel about the sun and temperatures. And then there are some shorts out there that I love that Patagonia makes that are the dirt roamer shorts that are seamless. And so there's no actually stitching. There's no stitching that you can feel on your butt. So if you're riding without chamois, that's like what I ride in. And then I would add ride pants. Like I just transition to ride pants rather than putting knee warmers on, because I don't wear the chamois that would keep the knee warmers up. I've also put long underwear on under my shorts, and that's worked great. I just have to be conscientious of like, well, do I really want to be wearing my long underwear? Because that is part of my warm and dry system for sleeping.
Yeah. A question about how often you use a back rack for your trips, which I love to use a little lightweight back rack on my mountain bike.
Yeah, there are some racks out there, and I'd love to see in the chat what people personally have used. The one in this photo is an old man mountain rack, but you can get racks that can mount on mountain bikes that are full suspension in a way that they're just on the rear triangle. So you can see in this picture, there's no part of the rack that's attached to the main triangle, which means that as the bike is moving within the different triangles of the bike are moving independently because of the suspension, the rack isn't inhibiting that, or the bike isn't making the rack break because the bike is trying to move. And so when you choose a rack, just making sure that one, it's light, but also it's going to be suitable for your bike if you have rear suspension. And I think racks are fantastic for people with less space, because it lets you have the room that you wouldn't have in a seat bag. It also lets you use a dropper post. And then on like bigger long road touring trips or on fat bike trips, like just really long trips where you have more stuff or you have to be able to carry more food, there's just so much more capacity.
Do you want to keep going with questions
Yeah.
or okay?
Oh, sorry. Maybe one more and then I'll keep going, and then I'd love to take all the questions at the end. I
Yeah,
just want
okay, I'll save them here.
to finish.
One question, do you need to make brake cables longer with the handlebar pack and other things to make room for setting them up?
That's a great question. I was going to talk about brake cables in this next section. So maybe I will roll into that now. And please keep the questions coming. We're just going to wrap up with the final Q&A so that if there are folks who are trying to leave when immediately at half past the hour, you can, and then you can get the questions later. Okay, so aligning your packing strategy with your bike and your route. Full circle back to goals. So both of these bikes, or I guess all three of these bikes, are perfectly packed for their trip. And you can see that they're very different in how they're packed. And you could also say, or I would say, that if the bikes on the right were to go on the trip that the bike on the left is packed for, which is a dirt road touring trip, those bikes would not be ideally packed for that trip. Just like how if this more gravel touring setup were to try to go on the single track focused, descent oriented, lift riding bikepacking trip of the bikes on the right, it wouldn't be set up ideally for that. And so how you load your bike is dictated by the terrain you're riding. So we're going to have two categories: roads and smoother surfaces, which could include snow, could include sand, pavement, smoother gravel. And then the next category after this will be trail / rougher terrain, such as rugged gravel 4x4 deep roads. So your packing strategy for the roads and smooth surfaces, you want an evenly balanced weight distribution so that when you think about that road touring bike, there's weight on those racks, but there isn't, I would imagine, that there aren't, all the heavy things aren't on the right side, and then all the light things are on the left side. Or you wouldn't put all the heavy things on the front part of the rack and just the light fluffy stuff in the back. Like, you want to evenly distribute it so that the bike is can track in a straight line, because the goal of this trip is to ride a long ways on roads. And riding on roads, you're trying to generally ride in a straight line, and you don't actually want your body to be having to work very hard at keeping your bike on course. And then the other thing is, if you were to see a picture of Noelle, whose bike this is on the bottom, standing next to the bike, Noelle looks really happy because she doesn't have a backpack on. Because riding on roads, you're often riding in one position. You know, maybe you'll stand up a little bit, but you're not like moving around to maneuver the bike a lot. You're riding pretty steadily. And so your body is going to be more comfortable. Your hands, your butt, and your feet will be more comfortable without weight on your back. And so that's why having the capacity that racks provide is so advantageous, or just large bags on hardtail frame bikes. That is very advantageous for the road style touring, because you don't have to put the weight on your back in a backpack. Yeah. And then you can see the bike above is similar, but that's set up. This one is set up for more of a backcountry road style route. So similar, you've got panniers, a handlebar roll, but with some front suspension. Then the other category would be taking your bike on trails or rougher terrain. And this would be where you need to be able to maneuver your bike like side to side, up and down, not just in a straight line. And so with these, when you pack these bikes, whether they're full suspension bikes or mountain bikes or even gravel bikes, like when people are riding gravel bikes on incredible things now, you want to have a lower center of gravity. And so you don't want a ton of weight out behind the rear hub, and you don't want a ton of weight out over the front hub, because that is going to very quickly impact how your bike moves. You also want to be able to see your front wheel, which may sound obvious, but it's easy to miss it, that once you start to add pockets to your handlebar roll or a rack to your front wheel, it's harder to see your wheel. And when you can't see your wheel, it's a lot harder to maneuver your bike in more technical or rougher terrain. Being able to enable a dropper post is huge for bike packing on harder terrain. It makes it a lot easier to actually lift up the front end when you're descending because you can get your weight back more. And with that, then suddenly you're navigating smaller seat bags or using a rack. Like you can see this person here is it has her seat post all the way down or drop her down, and her little rack allows her to do that. Standover clearance is more of a consideration because when you stop suddenly, unexpectedly, trying to ride something more technical, you just need to be able to have room to be able to step forward onto your bike, or not onto your bike, onto the ground. One thing with racks for this style of bike packing is that when you add panniers, if you're going to be hike-a-biking at all, which is generally pretty common in rougher terrain because it's so much harder to ride a loaded bike, panniers bulge out in a way that makes it a lot harder to push your bike without hitting your legs. Racks don't, like if you have a rack like this with a bag on top, but as soon as you have that extra width on the side, it's a lot harder to push. You're trying to minimize the weight on your fork, but the handlebar is often one of the places that you can have a lot of room. And so we'll talk about bulky things. And then because there's just generally less capacity because you need your bike to do so many things, you can get away with backpacks or hip packs more because you're also moving around a lot more. You're a lot more dynamic when you're riding rougher terrain. And so you're not just having the weight of your backpack sitting on your butt and your hands when you're pedaling, but because you're standing to get up over things, or you're shifting your weight, or you're descending quickly and then standing up and getting back down and shifting your weight forward and then shifting your weight backwards, like you actually do move around a lot more. And so I personally don't struggle with the weight on my backpack when I'm bike packing on a mountain bike. But as soon as this setup, I get on the road and have to pedal for maybe like 3 hours on the road, because that's usually part of bike packing, it's a lot less comfortable. So we're going to end with the ABCs of loading your bike. And after this slide is the Q&A. So if you're getting ready to go and you want this last nugget, this is what I have for you. And I do have a couple bikes behind me to show and tell this, but the ABCs go all the way to G. And these are just things to keep in mind and apply to both of the styles of loading your bike that we just talked about. The first thing is accessible. Are the things that you need during the day going to be easily accessible? Generally, the handlebar roll is the least accessible because you have to unclip the harness, undo the roll, and then dig out a very tightly packed bag. So things that you don't need during the day, like your camp stuff, is great to go in the handlebar bag. But then in your frame bag, where there are big zippers, and your top two bags, and your backpack, those are great places for the things that you need during the day, which are food and water. Maybe your repair kit could be somewhat accessible. Your first aid kit should be somewhat accessible. The phone and navigation stuff should be very accessible. Sunscreen, lip balm, any medications, all that. Your ride clothes also should be accessible. And again, there's no right or wrong place for you to put those things. Just make sure they're accessible. Because if they're buried at the bottom of your handlebar bag, you're probably not going to use them because you don't want to get them. And then you'll be grumpy. Balanced, we just talked about balanced. And so that really just is related to what is your style of riding. Are you trying to go for lower center of gravity and maneuverable, invisible front end? Or are you trying to go for is very comfortable and stable on down the road? Compressed. So someone asked about seat bags being stable when they're done right. I'm going to show you how with this bike here. This is a seat bag that is packed, and as I bounce the rear wheel, this doesn't move much because I stuffed this really tightly when it was off the bike, and I was able to put my body into pushing on the bag, and then I mounted the bike bag and compressed the straps. Every well-made bike bag going to have compression straps that are really secure. A lot of them have these flick lock tabs on the buckles. And so you can really yard on these things and then snap it down. Similar with the handlebar bag, these, when packed really well, they're going to be a very dense unit that when you squeeze them, there's like not airspace. As you can see, there aren't any places where it crinkles over, and there's nowhere that it looks like it's just holding air. And that's because when I packed this, I started, and it's an arm workout, and if you have long nails, you might want to reconsider that nail style. But it involves really pushing in and stuffing your fingers in the material. And so when I pack all of these bags, I'm not putting anything in folded or really specifically rolled, and definitely not in little stuff sacks. It's all just free in there. If when we're out of time, you want to see a demo, I can do a demo, but it looks like everything just like getting worked in and just fed bit by bit by bit by bit with fabric. And then at the end, really squeezing the air out of it and rolling it down. And then you have a full and tight bikepacking bag. And this could be the handlebar bag, or this could be the seat bag. And then when you put it on the bike, you use those compression straps. And that is what is going to keep everything from rattling. And one, rattling is annoying hearing, like to hear. You're going to be like, oh my God, is my bike breaking? And then it's also going to be, it's a risk management thing, because if you have a handlebar bag or a seat bag suddenly catching on the wheel or flying out, then you have a flying object going somewhere near your moving wheels, which could result in a very serious crash. And so those sagging, swaying seat bags or the handlebar bags that are like drooping out of the side, those are areas that we can work really hard to improve our packing, because it's just what's in there and how is it strapped on. Dry, most bikepacking bags are not waterproof. A number of the handlebar bags specifically could be, and you just need to check with that manufacturer. The material can be waterproof, but as soon as there are seams or zippers, then it's worth finding out, is this actually waterproof? And so with the handlebar bag being generally the most waterproof, it's also easy to line it with just a little trash bag. Then it's definitely waterproof if you don't put holes in it. That's a great place to have dry stuff that has to stay dry, like your sleeping bag or your camp clothes. And then when you're packing things in your seat bag and your frame bag and your backpack, just thinking like, can this get wet? Because if it gets wet, what's going to happen? And if not, then just put it in its own little like Ziploc type thing. But again, not rolled up. It'll pack better. The everything inside piece. This is a stylistic thing. There's certainly room for strapping things onto the outside of the bike when you don't have space and when it's appropriate for that thing to be on the outside of the bike. But you don't want to strap anything on your bike that is going to get damage from rubbing against trees or laying down on the ground or from crashing or from sun. And so that would include pretty much all of our clothes, our sleep system, our shelters. Things that do fine on the outside generally would be like shoes, insulate pad, like a foam pad, that sort of thing. And then the other thing to think about is when you're starting to add things that are strapped on, is just, are they secure, or are they going to cause some sort of catastrophic crash? And could they catch on anything that you're riding, especially if you're riding trail or in like more overgrown places? The firmly fastened piece, when I was riding the Great Divide mountain bike route that year, that on my little steel bike, met up with this guy that was riding it, and we're riding along, and then all of a sudden he was flat on the ground, and it was one of the scariest bike crashes I've ever seen. And it was all because one of his fork mount bags rotated into his spokes as we were going maybe 20 miles an hour down a dirt road. And so when you're strapping anything to your bike, it needs to be very secure. The bike bags, just make sure that the nylon straps are in good working order. And like we talked about, they're packed well and secured well, so they're not flopping around. But when we start to think about adding these fork mount bags or even these down tube bags, how things are strapped to the fork needs to be very intentional. Hose clamps and the like super duty zip ties can work well. And strap and putting like a layer of sticky tape on the fork first can help reduce rotation. And then that is where forks that have like specific braze-ons for mounting cages is great. And then the last one is graceful and glitter. And graceful is just like being mindful of, is anything rattling? Is everything tight? You don't want to be riding along wondering if something is rattling off your bike just because your pot is clanking around against the stove. And the glitter piece is just that I think that every bike we've ever seen packed is unique. And so make it your own and like bring your own personality to it. I love tying little sequin strips to my handlebars because it adds a little flair. Okay, so I was going to do a little demo for the handlebar bag stuffing, but I think given that it's 6:36 where I live, I want to create space for questions for people.
Yep. Ready for questions now? So one question, which is maybe just on this list that will probably be covered in a future talk, is about hydration and like how do you carry hydration?
Yeah, that will be at the next workshop on January 10th. And I think the only thing I'll just add to that for related to this workshop is that with those two different styles of loading bikes, the road style of having as much on your bike as possible, the frame bag is often a great place for water. And then additional places to mount water, like on your fork leg or on your down tube, there's room for additional water bottles. And then on that more rugged terrain where we're trying to get weight lower on the bike or on your back, the frame bag can be a great place. I like to only put one water bottle on my fork when mountain bike packing because my fork gets a lot heavier. Like it's really crazy how noticeable it is when there's suddenly two. And then I put water on my back because that is one place as a very small person that I can easily carry 2 or 3 liters.
And you, there's a similar question about putting a bladder in a frame bag, which I think is quite common. And then it shouldn't be an issue of then being able to drink if you have, if you're drinking directly from a bladder in a frame bag.
Yeah, a lot of frame bags have a little port integrated into the tip of the frame bag that you can run a little hose through, so it doesn't even have to come out of the zipper. And then this is on that kind of graceful slash securely fastened note. That hose is then in a very good place to just like swing right into your wheel. And so having some sort of system, whether it's like a magnet or a little like keychain zip pull thing, but a way of strapping it so that it sits on top of your handlebar roll or in your cockpit, and then you can pull it up to your mouth. Or you can just carry a bladder in your frame bag with no hose and just be refilling a water bottle out of it. So if you're in too much of a rush to be stopping on the side of the road to do things like that, well, that's your own choice, but I recommend generally stopping and enjoying the view and taking some time to refill your water bottle.
There's a question on what do you look for in pants in colder temperatures, or how many layers do you need for legs?
Oh, that is hard. It depends because it depends so much. A lot of companies are making ride pants now that are like actually quite breathable and comfortable to pedal in, but then are also like very comfortable around camp. And so I've been bringing those because I can ride in them, but then I can also pull them over my base layer, like long underwear style. And then for me, with those plus a pair of rain pants in if it's a wet trip, then I'm quite warm. And then for me, the big jump would then be going to puffy pants.
You ride in puffy pants?
I don't, but I could add them to my camp situation, especially it's like another great way to stay warm.
Okay. Couple questions on tire inserts, like thoughts on them, and then do you pack an extra tire sometimes?
Cool. So inserts, I haven't personally run inserts, but I know that people who have love them. They seem to make sense. You can run lower pressure, and that's going to make your ride more compliant. They are quite difficult to manage when you get a flat. So that's one thing to be aware of. Like it's going to make repairing a flat, taking the tire off a lot harder. And so I would think about that. They'll definitely protect your rims. And then with the spare tire, and so I should say all that to say, like, I would definitely experiment with riding with inserts. And if you have them on your bike, then go for it. Just make sure you know how to deal with them when you actually have a puncture that it doesn't seal. With the spare tire, I've never carried a spare tire with me. I've brought a spare tire on like long trips that I've left in my bike bag in other countries. But not needed it. And I have had like some fairly catastrophic sidewall tears that I've been able to field repair with a curved needle and really heavy duty thread. And on 2 occasions successfully not even breaking the seal of the tubeless bead. So I'd advocate more for like incredible tire repair skills than carrying a spare tire and just tubes, multiple tubes.
Question, my understanding about a carbon frame bike is they can't mount racks. Is this a reason not to choose a carbon frame for bike packing? And I don't think that's totally true these days.
Correct. Yeah, the pictures that I had earlier, like that there is a carbon frame bike. And with these old man mountain racks, they mount to the through axle and then they either mount straight up to the seat post and clamp to the seat post, or for this one, the rack goes through the through axle and then there's this little arm that bolts to these little mounts that you zip tie onto the seat stays. And so those work for carbon bikes. Yeah. They're great.
This is a question. Pros and cons of biking with front suspension, full suspension, rigid. Probably all depends on what you're doing and what your preference is. I've only ridden a rigid drop bar mountain bike, so I don't know any better.
Yeah, there is a whole little chart that I made for the Bikepacker's Guide book that I'm going to put in the PDF that I'll be sending out with this that breaks that down exactly, of like bike styles with different terrain. The pros and cons are going to come down to like weight and pedaling efficiency and maneuverability and comfort. But it all comes down to the route that you want to ride and your personal preferences.
Just a couple more questions here. Best bag system for a dropper post?
Oh, well, it depends a lot on how much room you have. So if you are on a hardtail, so your rear wheel is not moving at all in relationship to your seat post, then you can get away with a slightly bigger seat post bag or seat bag. But as soon as you're on a full suspension bike and the amount of room between your seat when it's dropped and the rear tire is shrinking whenever you're going through your travel, then you need an even smaller bag. My seat bags, like you can see behind me, that's on my trail bike, and that would be the biggest seat bag I'd be able to use on that and not use very much dropper. But you can reduce the travel of your dropper by getting a seat post collar for that fits the diameter of that dropper post. And it basically like identifies the spot at which it no longer is going to go down anymore. You can also kind of jerry rig those up with mounts for your rear blinky light or volet straps strapped around your seat post. But generally smaller is better. Revelate makes a fairly small bag. Wolf Tooth makes some pretty small roll top bags. Like the one on my down tube behind my shoulder would actually work on a seat quite well. And what I have found is that although sometimes it's ridiculous, it is still worth it to have a tiny bag that carries one thing. And so like that seat bag behind me has just my rain jacket. But the rain jacket has to go somewhere. And that's one less thing I'm putting in my backpack. Because honestly, for that setup, which is packed exactly how I took it on a 5-day single track trip, I'm going to have a fair amount of my water and then a lot of my bulkier layers in my backpack.
Couple questions about, do you recommend helicopter tape or something else for protecting frames from bag rub or cradles, other things?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I meant to say something, so thank you for asking that. Just that these frame bags, or sorry, all bike bags will rub inevitably, and depending on your frame style and paint style, they could rub fairly aggressively on the paint, just creating wear. And in some extreme examples, even maybe rub through the whole top sheet. And so putting on some sort of frame wrap tape, which could be as simple as electrical tape, but basically you just want a tape that's like going to protect from rubbing, and then when you pull it off, it's not going to hurt your frame.
There was a question about what helicopter tape is, which I don't know what that is either.
Me
Do you?
neither.
Okay.
I did see a question about bear bins. And yeah, bear camping with bikes is challenging. You have to follow the regulations for where you're going. I've never gone anywhere I have to carry a bear canister, but I have bike packed. Where I live is grizzly bear territory, and so I bike pack with a bear hang, and then I hang my food in my handlebar bag 100 yards from where I'm sleeping. And I've also carried an ursack, which is like a bag that bears can't get into. But those aren't allowed in all places that require bear food storage. But those are some ways around the bear bin canister.
Last written question on here is, I'd love some tips on how to utilize handlebar space when you have cables that get in the way of bag straps, computer, and light mounts.
Yeah, so with the cables, glad that we came back to that because I didn't talk about it in my rush. With the cables, so you can cut your cables longer so that you can loop your cables on your handlebar bag over your handlebar. You can also have them shorter so that they can actually be kind of nestled or cradled behind the handlebar harness. You just have to set it up in a way that as you're turning your bars, like the full rotation, those cables can still move. And then of course, they're not pinching the cables in a way that's inhibiting they're not pinching the housing in a way that it's inhibiting the cable from moving through the housing. And so this really just takes trying to set up your bike and then experimenting to make sure everything's working. But the longer cables, yes, that's a way to get around that. But I've always had a hard time getting cables over my bags. And so I tend to go with just rotating my brake levers down more. And then I have more room because they're not sticking out in front of my handlebars. They're sticking more down. And then I have room for my handlebar bag to be in front of it. And it would just be similar, like just be mindful of how you're strapping on your frame bag if you have externally routed cables on your frame.
Thanks to everyone in the chat for clarifying what helicopter tape is. There was a question about how do you keep food from small critters?
Like while camping. So we'll talk more about that in the camp skills workshop, but the main thing is just like having your food secured in a bag that critters can't get into. And you can go into hanging your food, but I think what I see most common with bikepackers is that their food just stays wherever it is, which could be in just a frame bag that's open or just in your backpack that is like right next to your head. And so what I do when not bear camping, but just camping and my food is closer to the ground, is I just consolidate all my food into either my handlebar bag or into my frame bag. And then I just zip it up closed and I wheel it off away from my tent or where I'm sleeping. There are stories, of course, and if you're like in populated places where there are aggressive rodents, like sure, they could definitely chew through things. And I think that that's where like you need to make your own judgment call on that.
Okay. Question just popped up. Have you done a remote mountain bike route without a backpack?
Hmm.
Thinking of racing, but have a back injury that makes it difficult to wear a pack.
Yeah. So I don't think I have personally. The closest I've gotten to is to bikepacking without a backpack is on a hardtail. But for me and my back injuries, I do better with full suspension and like a lightweight backpack, which could even be like a running vest, depending on where your back injury is. Like mine's down in my sacrum. So I generally need more like pelvis mobility, and I can put in on a little running vest that could carry a little bit of water or even just no water, but like the rain jacket and the bag of chips, like the things that really aren't going to weigh anything but do take up space. Like your tent fly, like you can water backpacks don't have to carry food and water. But if you're to go with the hardtail and if your back is okay riding that rigid frame, maybe with front suspension and like thick, fatter tires, then I bet, and depending on your height, then you could definitely do it. Like I'm just quite short, and so I have a hard time doing it, but I know a lot of the more average height people and taller people can bike pack for sure on mountain bikes without a backpack. And that's also a reason to look into bike packing on routes where you could stay in huts or stay in lodging or just reduce what like the extensiveness of your kit. And then the final thing on this note that I was also wanting to talk about is just that there's a really big difference between equality and equity. And so me bike packing on a full suspension mountain bike or just any bike really, and what my setup looks like is going to be really different if I'm by myself or if I'm bike packing with other people. And so when I bike pack with other people, as someone who's generally feels pretty strong but is very limited by space, I prefer with group gear to carry like smaller, denser things. Like I'll carry the stove or maybe some fuel, but I try to get the people who are, if they're taller and have more room than me and also are stronger because they're bigger, then they can carry more stuff. And I'm very okay with that. They should be carrying more stuff because proportionally, like they have more strength and weight, or not weight, sorry, space. And so I think that like, especially for smaller people or people who identify as women, like it can feel hard to be like, oh, I don't like that you want to pull your own weight. But I think that just remembering there's a big difference between what's equitable versus equal. And so, yeah, like with a back injury history, I'm very eager to be like, yeah, I don't need to carry that.
All right. Well, I think we covered most of the questions. I'm sure people could come up with more, but probably good to wrap it up.
Yeah. Thank you all for coming. I'll be sending a PDF with a lot more details on some of these things. And as I promised in our forthcoming workshops, starting January 10th, when we resume after the new year, we're going to have workshops that touch back on a lot of these topics around food and water, bike packing bags specifically, the self-care element, how to go chamois free, how to prevent some of these ailments, mindset, how to stay happy, the advanced navigation stuff, the camp skills that we've talked about, and troubleshooting field repairs. So while this was a lot of information, we're just going to build on it, and hopefully we see you again.
Yep, thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you.
All right, have a great night.